well, at least there are some ways of, there are some water heaters and there's some ways of space heating with that are electric. And so you can have what they're trying to reach is having all electric buildings. Sorry, just to back up 1 second. And there's this gap, and natural gas is not just a large area, an area where there's a lot of energy consumption, but it's also using a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, which you probably know, just thinking about natural gas. But the city of Berkeley found that burning natural gas accounted for 27% of their total greenhouse gas emissions. And Columbia University recently found that natural gas accounted for 42% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions. So then looking at the challenges that these cities had when they were implementing their city ordinances, the one challenge was restaurants and just people enjoy their gas stoves. A lot of people cooking on a gas stove is really an important part of their home, or something that they cherish in their home. And so while heating or cooking on gas stoves doesn't amount to a lot of greenhouse gas emissions in itself, there's a large fixed cost in setting up pipelines to new constructions. And then once the fixed cost has already been paid for, it's cheaper to heat your house that way. And so even though stoves are a small part of, so it's turned out to be a large problem. The California Restaurant Association sued the city of Berkeley, claiming that because the city of Berkeley was one of the cities that had a ban on natural gas in new constructions, and the California Restaurant Association said that chefs wouldn't be able to make their specialties if they didn't have gas stoves, and a lot of people aren't ready to switch to electric stoves. So that's one reason why perhaps an alternative, lower, more carbon neutral alternative to natural gas might be better than switching to electric. Another challenge that cities had, sorry, just checking the time, was state preemption. There's an idea that states are the ones that regulate natural gas and that cities shouldn't be the ones deciding interacting with natural gas. In Massachusetts, the city attorney for Cambridge, Massachusetts, was thinking of passing a natural gas ban, but they ultimately decided not to because they were worried that the Massachusetts Attorney General would say that the state preempts the city's authority to create laws about natural gas. However, Brookline, Massachusetts, another city, passed a natural gas ban, and the state attorney general didn't avail themselves of suing the city or trying to establish preemption. And so that doesn't seem at this point like it's an issue. And it's certainly not in California, or it hasn't even been raised as an issue. Another challenge that some energy graduate students have thought of is grid resiliency. The idea that if we just try to convert buildings completely and cars to electricity, that the grid might not be prepared at peak times or during the summer to handle that penetration of electricity. But I tend to think of that as that's true of electrifying vehicles and the renewable portfolio standard, and it hasn't stopped people from advancing those policies. So I don't see that as a different problem here. And technology is another challenge. Sorry, just glancing at my notes. So electric heat pumps are what are used to heat buildings in all electric buildings. And heat, it's not as easy to supply it on demand using an electric heat pump right now or in cold climates. But I'd love to hear about that if any of you, that's your research topic, I would love to hear about that. And resistance heaters for stovetop cooking. But they're expensive so far and inefficient. So technology needs to probably advance some for this to become a more widespread policy. So looking forward, those are the main challenges. And all 10 to 12 California cities have passed their ordinances and they haven't been challenged in court. And so it seems like they are viable so far. And so the next question is, how can we advance these policies if our goal is to decarbonize and to decarbonize by banning natural gas installations? So one thing I think that's probably pretty likely is these same 10 cities could expand these policies to include commercial and industrial buildings. I think that is likely. And another option is these 10 cities could expand these policies to include retrofitting old buildings or deconstructing pipelines that already go to old buildings. And I don't think that's as likely. What these policies, I think, are trying to do is change the fleet of buildings for the next couple of decades, the next 50 years. And you don't have to spend money on deconstructing old buildings. And that also means that there aren't stranded costs, which is something people get concerned with sometimes. Another way that this policy could expand is if more cities ban natural gas. I also think that that's coming on the horizon. I forgot to mention, these 10 cities passed these policies in the last spring, and they came into effect in January 2020. So these are really new. I expect more cities will be banning natural gas and possibly on the horizon a state law, but that would be much in the future. So I think that's what I had planned to talk about. Does anyone have any questions now at this time?
So Rebecca, we have a question coming in from Greg, who's a graduate student here. It says the city of Davis does have a natural gas ban for new single-family residential buildings in place in the form of a REACH code, forcing mixed fuel buildings to be so efficient that it would not be cost effective compared to all electric. This went into effect in January 2020. So I think that's just adding to the list maybe that's going on.
Oh, right. Yeah, I had not classified that as a ban on natural gas because it was, it was a REACH code. But you could classify that as banning natural gas. I mean, there's I think about 20 or 30 that have more, that have REACH codes.
All right, any other questions for Rebecca? We can move on to Erfan, and if there's a question that pops up, we can head back to Rebecca at the end of all. Oh, we have another comment here. So Teresa has a question, and I'll just go ahead and unmute her so she can ask that to you directly. Let's find her. Here you go, Teresa. All right, you're on.
Yay, I get to talk. I thought that'd be easier than typing.
Yeah, that's no worries.
So I just had a few observations, I guess. When you were talking about the gas stoves and, the cost of running infrastructure for, limited end uses like cooking. One thing I think is also relevant that we've been thinking about is the leakage in the natural gas distribution system, which is not talked about that frequently. And, but could be on the order of several percentage points, and an unburned molecule of methane has like 25 times the impact of when after it's actually burned. So, you know, a 4% leakage rate would like double your greenhouse gas impact of that natural gas. And I think if we continue to use natural gas, but we use it at a lower rate, but the gas lines remain pressurized at the same pressure, you're still going to have all that leakage. And it's going to become like it's going to become more significant. So I just think that's another just kind of an interesting point I wanted to share. And the other thing about heat pump, the issue of distribution, I think another thing that's being a little bit electricity distribution. One thing that's being a little bit overlooked there with a big push for space conditioning heat pumps is that we have this big issue with peak demand in the summer for air conditioning that the utilities are constantly dealing with. And it tends to be late evening when your solar production goes down, and that's how we get this duck curve. But if we make a big push for heat pumps, which, you know, I'm not against that, but I think one of the things that may be being overlooked is that that's going to create large demand in early morning when people tend to use their natural gas heating. Again, you know, this could be 5, 6, 7 a.m. as commercial buildings, you know, thermostat setbacks kick in or revert back to, you know, warm buildings. And so I think that there needs to be some planning around that that's not necessarily currently happening. And that from some reports I've seen, that demand could actually be even greater than the air conditioning issues that we currently face.
Oh, interesting.
And there's a report, if you want, I have that. I have an interesting forecast on that. If you want to, here's your email. I'll send it to you. It's on.
That'd be great. Thank you. Yeah, I'll probably reach out to you after this. These are really interesting.
And my last thought on the coronavirus issue is that we all buildings got like abandoned so quickly that I don't really think I actually, after being gone out of our office for a week, I thought, oh, I should go shut down the HVAC system. So I went back and shut off our HVAC system a couple days ago. I just killed the breakers because I figured, well, that's the easiest way. So, you know, I think there's like a lot of opportunity to like completely, reduce energy in commercial buildings to offset all the residential energy use that's happening right now in schools. But I just don't know if people have really had time or even thought about it, right? And all chaos. Like school districts are right now trying to figure out distance learning, like is our facilities going and, you know, changing building controls, and I have no idea. So.
Yeah. Have you heard of benchmarking? Is that something you've been talking about?
Sorry?
Oh, have you heard of benchmarking? Just sending reports to building owners about how much energy they're using. I really like that idea, just to keep it in people's minds when they're thinking about something else, which is always. I don't know if you've heard of benchmarking policies, but that's.
No, not super familiar.
I actually just got a report from PG&E about my energy use since COVID started, which is kind of interesting to look at from a homeowner perspective. But we have 2 other comments, questions coming in. So I recognize both of these. I'm just trying to I don't think our meeting is being Zoom hacked. So I will open them up. I will unmute. It looks like Greg Miller had one more comment. So Greg, I'm going to unmute you here. Let's see. So Greg, I got to find you first on the list. There you go, Greg. So Greg, if you wanted to ask your question, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was just following up from the comment about the City of Davis ban. I actually worked on helping draft the City of Davis's all-electric REACH code, and basically the Building Decarbonization Coalition, who's been leading most of this work at the local level in the state of California, has been suggesting the use of REACH code strategies instead of outright bans in order to avoid the lawsuits that we're starting to see like in Berkeley and that. So I think that you're going to be seeing a lot more of these kind of bans that aren't called bans to try to avoid lawsuits from the the natural gas industry and others like the California Restaurant Association.
Oh, that's smart. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, we had another comment from Reese Davis. So Reese, I'm going to unmute you next here. You are unmuted.
All right, great. Yeah, I just, my first question was just, you may have mentioned this, I might have just missed it, but are there cities considering like other natural gas policies, such as just like requiring a certain percentage of like RNG or hydrogen, like higher than that, than the like gas utilities are aiming for like by 2030?
That's a great question. I don't want to get it wrong. Do you mind if I look into it and send you an email after this? I'm sorry. I know that.
Oh yeah, no problem. And also, I do just want to note that I work at the Energy Conservation Office, and just to Teresa's point about shutting down campus, yeah, we're not able to like totally shut down all the buildings. Like there's some degree that we can with coronavirus, like the buildings not being occupied, but there are definitely still a lot of them that have to be on. So and people are definitely using more electricity in their homes. So it is interesting.
All right, and we have another question from Kelly Cunningham, who I think is showing up as Kelly Fleming. So I will unmute you, Kelly. You're good. Oop.
I think you're looking for the other Kelly.
The other Kelly. Okay, let me find you, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for unmuting me. I have a question. I'm Kelly from Pacific Gas and Electric. I work as the Reach Codes lead for PG&E and have contributed to the cost effectiveness studies for the cities throughout the state of California. So that supports the Reach Codes across the state. So you made some comments about the natural gas infrastructure being paid for, but the developers and builders only pay for part of the cost of actually installing that infrastructure, and society pays for the rest for up to 50 years through ratepayer fees. So therefore, there is a tremendous need for data on exactly how much this costs statewide. And only there are very few sources of this data that are out there right now that are publicly available and can be used by persons looking to do this type of policy work or reach codes. So are you aware of anyone else collecting data that could be used to understand that gas infrastructure cost? Is UC Davis taking on any of this type of work?
Not that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there are CPUC analysts who are completely involved in figuring out the exact cost of installing infrastructure versus reach. I mean, the public advocate's office, I'm sure they have dedicated, analysts. But I agree that UC Davis should be. I would love to meet someone who's working on that. That would be. I'm kind of siloed in the law school, but I completely agree. More data is absolutely needed.
Yeah, and if you need a data source for when you're looking at some of these things that you've been looking into, I hope you're looking at the cost-effective reports on localenergycodes.com, which is the cities are using. And if you see something that you don't think is correct about heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, gas infrastructure costs, or any of these, please reach out to me and help us correct these so that we're providing the best foundation for cities to consider moving forward. So I can serve as a point of contact for that going forward.
Great, thank you.
That's great. And I can provide, Rebecca, afterward emails for a few of the commenters here so you can follow up. Let's see, we have one more comment and then we'll move on to the next presentation. I'm not sure who's the exact name, it's TB Rung. So if that's you, I will unmute you now and you can ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me? This is Terry Brungard with the LADWP.
Yeah, hi Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, we've looked at building electrification, and we're still kind of on the fence and looking at each individual case on a case-by-case basis. And it's primarily because of the RPS, our renewable portfolio standard. We're still in, we're in the above 30% renewables. we're probably in the high 30s, but that still means a lot of our electricity is generated by fossil fuels. And considering that natural gas is one of the cleanest of the while it is a fossil fuel, it's one of the cleanest compared to coal and oil. We still feel that you could be actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions by forcing people to go to 100% electric appliances. So that's our position on that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that's why I like that they're not, none of these policies require, it's only on new construction. So it's looking at the fleet of buildings that will exist in 50 years when the RPS has ramped down. But I completely hear you, and that's a great point.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to Erfan, and then if there's additional questions that pop up, feel free to send me your question, and I will make sure to unmute you after Erfan's presentation. Thanks so much, Rebecca. It was great hearing what you've been working on.
Thank you.
So hello, everyone. My name is Erfan Rasouli, and I'm an R&D engineer in the Western Cooling Efficiency Center for a couple of years. So I have been working with Professor Narayanan for almost about 9 years. So I was a PhD student working with Vinod back in Oregon State University. Then I graduated from there, and then Professor Narayanan moved to UC Davis. I became a postdoc here in UC Davis for a couple of years, and now I'm an engineer. So I started some old projects with Vinod, and then we continued those researchers down here in UC Davis. So around 2015 and 16, we decided to put together a test facility dedicated to high pressure and high temperature experiments. Because of all of those safety hazards related to these kind of experiments, we ended up to have a space in the outdoor in south of the campus of the UC Davis. And we started installing and manufacturing on all of those equipments and taking the equipments over there and then connect them together and make our test loop. So this project that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is the first project that was actually the motivation to put together that test facility. And this project is about solar thermal receivers. So moving to the first slide. So back in 2011, Department of Energy launched the Sunshot Initiative. And the whole goal of this initiative was to reducing the cost of solar energy down about 75% or up to 6 cents per kilowatt hours by 2020. So from 2011 to 2020, about a decade time to reduce that cost to 6 cents per second. So on the plot on the right shows the bar charts and the existed cost in different sectors, residential, commercial, and utility. So the goal was to reduce this 28 cents that was around 2010 down to 6 cents. So around 2017, Sunshot Initiative announced that they reached to that goal. So they set a new goal for next 10 years from 2020 to 2030 to reduce this number further down to half, so 3 cents per second. This project that we started back in Oregon State and then here in UC Davis was related to the first round of the projects that the first phase started actually in 2012, and then we are almost wrapping up that project. So concentrated solar power plants. So we have different techniques to convert the sun energy to the electricity. The most obvious is using the PVs, but here the focus of this research and this project is using the thermal energy. So imagine that there is a big filled up mirror heliostats that are reflecting the sun to a central tower, which is shown here. And then there are media that are going into this tower, absorbs the heat, and the heated media goes either directly to the power generation or goes to do some storage containers, and with some heat exchangers we can run these power generations once that sun is down. So sometimes we call these CSP power plants as a peaker power plants, because this storage has been always a major component of this kind of systems. There are 3 different pathways for this kind of power plants, and all of them are dictated by how we're going to absorb this heat at this receiver. So these pathways are called like a liquid, they call it molten salt pathway, and solid pathway, which is using the falling solid particles, or the gas phase. We use the carbon dioxide. These are 3 pathways that CSP or Sunshot Initiative pursued starting from 2010 or 2011, and they are still pushing different projects in each of these pathways to see that at the bottom which one has some advantages, what's the cons, what's the pros. So the project that in this presentation is going to focus on the gas phase. So we are looking on just this component, the receiver, not other components, that this receiver works with the carbon dioxide. So how it works, so the carbon dioxide, when it's at high pressure, higher than 1000 psi, or if I give it in SI unit higher than 72 bar, and if the temperature goes higher than 31 degrees C, it from the gaseous state or liquid state, it forms a supercritical state, which is something between gas and liquid. It has much higher density than the gas, but still lower than the liquid, but still is in the form of gaseous. Just imagine like a fog. So we can have better thermophysical properties, but still is gaseous that we can run through long distances without that much of the powering cost. So in this state, we're going to send the CO2 up to this tower at still very high temperature, 550 degrees C, and then heat it up further to 720 degrees C. And this heated CO2 can directly go to the power generation, which is again another field of the turbomachinery that are compatible with the supercritical carbon dioxide, which we're not talking here. Or these can go through some heat exchangers and then heat up some phase change material or even the molten salt here to store the heat there. And also, other than the temperature, the pressure of the interest that we started this project was about 200 bar or about 3000 psi. So for these gaseous pathway, there were different contributors. One of them was Oregon State University. At that time, we as Oregon State University, we presented a concept of using the microchannel technology. I'm not going through the details of what is the microchannel technology, but just imagine that these are very teeny tiny small flow passages that the fluid pass through them, but still these are large enough to efficiently transfer the heat from the outside or from the incident heat flux into the fluid without wasting space because we have a packed area on top of that tower. So if this shows a sample of one of those small unit cells in the microchannels, then these unit cells stick together, forms like a panel on the right, and on the bottom shows these meter by meter panels with some fluidic piping on the back, and these are sitting next to each other to form that tower. And that kind of represents the kind of concept that we suggested at that time. So definitely we started with some simulations, some modeling to see that microchannel technology is able to provide a high efficiency heat absorption into the fluid or not. I don't have that much of the details here, but just referring to the term of efficiency. This efficiency has been defined as whatever heat that goes into the fluid divided by whatever heat that comes into the receiver. If we exclude, so this heat that is incident heat that comes into, most of it goes into the fluid, but definitely part of it gets reflected, and a fraction of it forms the heat losses as radiation and convection losses. What is our interest is higher this Q fluid B, we're gonna have a higher efficiency. So our modeling at that time showed that we can have up more than 90% of the efficiency in the range of heat fluxes that is a goal of the project. So it was 2-3 years project. We started with the proof of concept with very small samples, even small as 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter microchannels. We proved the concept. At the end of 3rd year, we ended up we fabricated 1 microchannel, which is combined of 2 unit cells that had the overall dimensions of 8 centimeter by 8 centimeter. Picture left shows the exploded view of how that microchannel receiver looks like. So there are different layers. Each of them has different channels into it. And these layers are sitting on top of each other and goes through the diffusion bonding process. There are some details here, like some interface coatings that should happen in order to have good bond. But eventually, these get pressed at high temperature, and over a certain duration of the time, these interfaces melt together, and we have our one-piece receiver. This picture in the middle, if I show you how the fluid look like inside these cavities, it's gonna look like this. So the fluid comes from one header to this 8x8. It splits in 2 halves, goes to the top and the bottom, and it goes through some side channels, and it feeds the very greenish color plate that sees the incident heat flux. Then it heats up, collects in the central, I call it pipe, and then exits the microchannel. The picture on the right shows, the inset picture actually shows how that 8x8 receiver look like, and with just 2 pieces of the tubing sticking out, and some of the layers before diffusion bonded. So we had, at the end of that project, we had this test article in our hand, and this became good sacrifice or victim to use it to move into the next phase, because next phase was to make test articles bigger in size. The size was 15 centimeter by 15 centimeter, and also tested on sun. In order to do the on-sun testing, we had to make different equipment, put it together, but we had to verify that each of these equipments are performing well. So we used that 8x8, and in order to verify that all of the equipments that we assembled and put together, they are working properly. So this picture on the left shows a burner that the exhaust of this burner goes into the right, which is, I call it test chamber. And inside this chamber, we have a very hot, about 800 degrees C environment, and we place our test article here first, because before doing any further experiment on sun testing, we have to first verify that, hey, if we pressurize these test articles, are they gonna hold that pressure, are they structurally safe and sound or not. So we place it inside without any heat. We just pressurize it. If it passes, we move to the next phase. We turn on the burner, provide a very high temperature environment around this test article. And again, we pressurize this test article, either static or just do some cyclic testing. I mean, pressurize it to the 200 bar, release the pressure. Pressurize it, release the pressure, while this test section is just sitting at very high temperature. That we use that 8x8 test articles to verify that this equipment, this burner facility is working on fine. The plot on the right actually shows some of the experiment results that we had at that time. So for about 6 cycles, we pressurized this test article to a little higher than 200 bar, while the dashed line shows the temperature of this test article throughout of the test, which was about close to 600 degrees C. One other test that we have to, the ones that we put together equipments we have to do prior to on-sun testing was flow distribution. So again, we place, maybe it's not clear, but that test article is sitting here. We have an IR camera in front of it, and then we send very hot flow inside the microchannel, and then we use the IR to see that in very fraction of the minute, maybe 10, 20 seconds, how this temperature profiles is gonna be on the outside. And if we have a uniform temperature distribution, at least that's an indication that, hey, the flow is uniformly flowing through the channels. Of course, there were a bunch of the simulation, safety simulation to make sure that we have a uniformity of the flow. But again, we have to validate it by these experiments here. We used that 8x8 for this experiment as well. This top bluish and reddish color shows the IR picture of that test article in a transient condition. So the fluid comes, these arrows shows the fluid comes from the left, and then it goes to the sides, and from the sides it goes inside the unit cells, from the top to the middle and bottom to the middle, and goes out. And since this 8x8, still that we see that some sections are not showing good flow distribution, doesn't show the uniformity of the temperature here. That's one indication that we may not have, at least for that test article, we don't have good flow distribution. But since the purpose of these experiments, we're just using this test article to validate all of the components, we move forward. So next couple of slides are showing the simplified sketch of how our test facility look like. This greenish box here is actually a container that we have a frame inside. This frame holds a pump for the CO2, a reservoir, bunch of the fluidic lines, bunch of the valves, control valves, pressure regulators, which the picture of this frame is shown on the right. Then we use this frame to push the liquid CO2 into the system. Before sending this CO2 up to the receiver, we have a section that we use that propane burner and that chamber that we use for the pressure and temperature testing. It's a dual use for us. We use it here to preheat the flow, because I showed that in earlier slides that we have to, the goal is that we push we increase the temperature to 500 degrees C before reaching to the receiver. So we use this preheating section to preheat the flow. And then once that it's preheated, it goes into the dish, solar dish, and from the solar dish, once it's heated further, it comes down to series of heat rejections. We call it first stage, second stage, and third stage before going back to this frame. Next slide shows another 3D view of our solar site. That container with the frame inside, that preheater section here, the solar dish that we assembled here, and that microchannel receiver is gonna sit on top here. It comes down, and these are a series of those heat exchangers that we have. And we have to make sure that the CO2 is back to the liquid and goes to the container, to the reservoir. Next slide shows our solar facility at work. So we installed that 8x8 receiver on top of the focal point. Then we started tracking the sun. So this glowing part, we don't see that 8x8, which is dark color, because it's just all sun concentrated there, and it's just glowing. And so we ran these experiments in 2 days. First day was almost further in the afternoon, about 3 p.m. The other one was right at noon. And also you see that the sky was had different conditions of the clouds. So in the first day, we had much more clear sky rather than the second day. I'm kind of referring to these clouds because next slide, I'm showing here the transient temperature and pressures changes over the time. So the first plot on the left plot shows some of the recorded temperatures and pressures over the time in the first day, and the right plot shows those measurements in the second day. In the left part, just I refer to this reddish color line. This shows the receiver outlet temperature. So we see that before this solar dish hits the sun, the temperature is after that preheating section that we had, it was less than 100 degrees C. But as soon as it hits the sun, there is a sudden jump in that temperature, and it goes to about 170, 180, and it stays there. If we see how this red color line or receiver outlet temperature changes in the second day, which was actually at noon, so higher incident heat coming into the receiver, but it was cloudish, we see how it changes. Once that it hits, there is a jump in the temperature, but it takes few minutes in order to reach to higher temperature. On the left, the max temperature in the first day, the max temperature we could have, it was about 170, 80 degrees C, but in the second day, we had more than 300 degrees C at the exit of receiver. Then we use this recorded data to further analyze system and then calculate some of the parameters of interest, which one of them is I mentioned, is the receiver efficiency. And these blue triangles are showing that receiver efficiencies in the first day. The white triangles are showing receiver efficiencies in the second day. We see that in the first day, we had incident heat flux about 20 watt per centimeter square, which was further in the afternoon, was 3-ish p.m. But in the second day, it was around noon, we could have much higher incident heat flux, about 80 watt per centimeter square. So
Erfan, we have just a few more minutes. Just a few more minutes before questions.
Sure. Okay. So it's almost done. So this slide shows in the second day, this test article definitely became a victim, or we sacrificed it because of that bad flow or malflow distribution that we observed that time, that indeed caused the failure of the test section in the middle of experiments. And this shows some small hole that was poked into this guy, because we are dealing with a very high pressure, about 150 bar was CO2 pressure during the experiments. Then we sent this guy to our partners in NETL in Albany, Oregon, So they cut it in sections and then see that what was the failure reason. And I'm not discussing this, but one of the difficulties that in the diffusion bonding people are dealing with that is that a good bond. We can't always guarantee that we have a perfect bonding for all of these features. Thus, we found some sections that apparently during the diffusion bonding, they were not melted and there wasn't really good bond, and that maybe one pin caused the whole system fails. So we had some further developments in our site in 2019, and even now that we reinforced or we updated our installation of the pipings because we saw through those experiments that, hey, we cannot have that much of the high temperature of 500 C on top of the dish. So we had to update all of our installation in one line. Also, one of the things that we saw that in our preheater, we couldn't have much higher temperature, the temperatures that we were expecting. So we had to make a new preheating core that sits inside that chamber to heat up the test. One of the upcoming tests that we are waiting for that, our partners now in Oregon State, they are in charge of designing and fabricating that 15 by 15 centimeter test article. This picture shows one of the articles that they made. And once that they did some proof testing, static testing, they're gonna send it to us and then we do our experiments here. This concludes my presentation for today.
Thanks so much, Erfan. Really interesting, and I know we're all looking forward to actually visiting the facility once things all clear up. So we have some time for questions. So if you have them, feel free to put them in the chat and I will unmute you.
Hi, my name is Ines, and I was wondering what was the most challenging part of onsen testing?
It's assumptions, what I can say, because on the paper, on the simulation, we always assuming something that maybe it seems very simple, but in reality, it's hard to reach to that assumptions. So for example, that picture here showed a couple of the things that we had to update our system because we were thinking that we can have, for example, certain temperatures up in our solar dish. But assuming that those kind of insulation that we are using are sufficient, but they were not, and because all of our modeling stuff are showing that that's okay, but we ended up to having, for example, there is a very small tube here, 3/4 inch tube here, but we have about 8-inch radius thickness of the insulation all around it just to keep the heat inside. So achieving to those numbers that it's very hard. The preheating the CO2, it's hard. And in order, just make it short, we have to be very careful about those assumptions and then we validate them in real world.
All right, thank you.
Great, and we have another question from Mahir. Mahir, I'm gonna unmute you here in just a second. There you go.
Yeah, my question was around just getting your thoughts on the cost analysis of microchannels versus larger scale channels. I can imagine you need a more material for a microchannel than a larger scale channel, especially when you try to scale it up as you referred to earlier in your presentation. So I wanted to get your perspective on how the cost analysis looks for this.
So first of all, I'm not a cost guy, but what I can say in the microchannels, so at least for this gas phase, we are looking to very high pressure and high temperature. Definitely those metals that we are used to, like a stainless steel, they are not working. So we are looking into the nickel superalloys. Here, all of our samples are made from Haynes 230, which is one of the nickel superalloys. So they are expensive. But once what we are talking about the larger scale, in order to hold that pressure, we need a lot of thickness. If you're talking about the tubes, for example, we should have about maybe 1/8 or maybe a 1/4 inch thickness of the tube in order to hold that 200 bar pressure. But once that we go to the micro channels, the channels are smaller. The supporting, based on the supports that need, maybe I have a picture here. So we are talking about thicknesses of maybe 0.5 millimeter, maybe 1 millimeter. So all of those wall thicknesses becomes much smaller. So at last, we ended up to having very less weight panels. If we wanted to, we had those bunch of inch size piping in that in that tower. So, but there is definitely a cost analysis is going on because CO2, again, the first slide I mentioned that they are very, very precautious about the cost. And our partners in Oregon State University, they are doing that section, which I don't have the knowledge of that. But just I wanted to add this comment that from the microchannel perspective, we are reducing the amount of the material used on the receivers.
Great.